Yeah. The book we're discussing is The 7 Principles of Making Marriage Work, chapter 1. And we're doing it for fun because it's kind of fun to read the book together and improve on marriage and yeah.
So it's been a few weeks for me since I've read this chapter. Is this the one where he basically says how cool he is, yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like, I'm so good, I can use science, real science, and look at you within 15 minutes and say, are you gonna last or are you not gonna last?
With 91% prediction rate.
Yeah.
Impressive.
Yeah. And he describes the study.
And he's from UW.
He's from UW. He describes the study, and the study to me sounds pretty scientific. Yeah. So here's the first thing you highlighted.
Yeah. So he said that happily married couples aren't smarter, richer, or more physiologically astute than others. But in their day-to-day lives, they have hit upon a dynamic that keeps their negative thoughts and feelings about each other from overwhelming their positive ones. So I guess for me, the thing that kind of stood out here is that he thinks that it's not really about people being like smart or maybe like rich or something, but that it's just the ability of being able to, I guess, highlight the positives and stay away from negatives.
Well, not necessarily stay away from negatives. The negatives will be there regardless. It's like it's about like having 55, let's say, percent of the interactions being positive versus like 90% of your interactions are all about like nagging and super negative.
Yeah.
And so if you have a healthy balance of like more positive interactions versus negative, like there is a balance. You can't have 0 negative interactions.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
So this is the first thing that you highlighted.
So the more emotionally intelligent a couple, the better able they are to understand, honor, and respect each other and their marriage, and the more likely that they will indeed live happily ever after. So I guess this one was like, it works well with what we just talked about, because like emotional intelligence, you can't buy it. Because you're rich doesn't always translate into you're more emotionally intelligent
or smart. Yeah.
And so basically, like, anyone, rich or poor, can be emotionally intelligent, and that will help make the marriage last.
Mm-hmm.
And so the book that we started but didn't finish about emotional intelligence, I kind of looked at it and like, oh, maybe like I should restart it and finish that.
Maybe our next book.
Maybe. Okay, I highlighted a couple more things. So he talked about how 35%
unhappy marriage can increase your chances of getting sick by roughly 35%.
Yes.
Which makes sense. It's like if you're stressed and unhappy.
Yeah.
I mean, stress causes a lot of health issues.
Yeah, so he talks about how if you feel physically stressed and usually emotionally overworked as well, that creates like basically a problem to your health. So because of that, you don't live maybe as long as you would hope.
Or not as healthy.
Yeah, and he says people who stay married live 4 to 8 years longer than people who don't. So it's in both of our interests to make sure that the marriage works, so that we can enjoy this cute little planet for longer.
Very cute. Very little.
Little compared to the universe.
So, this one was interesting. The biggest myth of all is that communication, and more specifically, learning to resolve your conflicts, is the royal road to romance and an enduring, happy marriage. So it's interesting because I feel like communication is part of emotional intelligence. But he'll bring up some more points throughout this book because I read a little bit more that kind of explained it to me. But he says that just being able to communicate well, do like active listening and so on, it helps. But there are couples that don't know how to communicate well or do active listening, but they have other ways of being able to keep their arguments positive. And like, I guess he's going to talk about like 4 horsemen but anyway, so there are other ways of keeping the relationship positive, even if you don't know how to communicate well.
This is still like, I read this chapter, and I guess maybe because I didn't read the other chapters, I was like, what do you mean communication? Like, I guess it kind of makes sense. Like, you might be a very good communicator, but if, I don't know, your life goals are different, like you might have a common understanding, but the differences between you and the other person are so big that even like being okay with communication doesn't really solve like the problem of you still feeling alone.
Yeah,
I would think.
Yeah, and then he talks about like different problems. Some problems you can't solve, and so you need to figure out how to, even like if you can communicate very well, but you come across a problem that you're not able to solve, you can communicate about this problem all the time. It will just make you tired and frustrated that it's not going away, and the issue is going to stay there, and it's going to negatively impact your marriage.
Yeah.
Even though you know how to communicate.
Like let's say if someone says, I don't want to have children because I want to travel.
Yeah.
And another one is like, oh, yeah, like your point is valid. That makes sense. But that person is like, but I want to have children because whatever reason. Then like another person could be like, oh, that makes sense. And you're like, yeah, that all makes sense. But then how do you actually, then you still live unhappy because...
Yeah. So that chapter I actually didn't read yet, how to solve those issues, but...
So he talks about how the most common method for resolving conflict is active listening. That he kind of calls like, oh, it's good, but it's not really good. Which was kind of interesting because when you and I went to therapy, we basically preached after the therapy how active listening is important.
Yeah.
He does talk about how in some cases it does help, but the amount of people that it doesn't help, I don't remember the percentage. It was huge.
Yeah. It's... I think when he goes, like when we read through the book more, you realize that it wasn't just the active listening that helped us. We were doing other things that we didn't know are important.
Okay. And like to explain what active listening is, it's basically if there is a problem, I talk about like, hey, here is how I feel. Let's say like socks. I always bring the example of socks. Like, hey, I feel like when I put my socks around, like it's not a big deal, and I feel very hurt if I'm being nagged about my socks, because I should have a freedom of throwing the socks around wherever I want, whenever I want, and so on. And what you would do is you would repeat what you heard, which is
Just you like to throw away socks. Just to throw socks everywhere.
and then I would confirm of like, no, but it's not just about socks, it's me feeling like I'm free to make my own choices. That's also what I meant. And you'll be like, oh, thank you for clarifying. So that's kind of like active listening. And then I would listen to your thing and kind of repeat it back to you with empathy.
But you see, he does say that conflict resolution is certainly easier if the party expresses empathy for the other perspective.
Which is basically what
active listening
does. Yes.
Yeah, that's one of the 7 principles, is resolving issues that you can resolve.
Because like with active listening, still like it's not just like very often in conflicts you start arguing and you forget to listen to another person and you start replying in your head something. And so you completely like missed half of the conversation because you were almost like monologuing with yourself. And like active listening makes you stop and actually listen because you have to repeat it back, so you better know what the other person is saying. So
yeah, he just repeats it again, but then he says that also active listening is actually very difficult. It's very difficult, and a lot of couples, no matter how much they try, they fail at it.
Yeah.
And I mean, we've noticed that before as well, is that sometimes in the middle of the argument, like we'll bring up active listening and another person's going to be like, no, can't do it right now.
Yeah.
So you kind of have to, do other things like, okay, maybe let's wait until we discuss later when we can actually do active listening.
But you know what I think with active listening? If you know you're about to discuss a problem, you start discussing it without active listening. And then you see things are going south. So you're like, how about we do active listening? I think that's when it's hard because you're already emotionally so like triggered that it's very hard to be like, yeah, let me turn my emotions off, calm down, and like do the active listening. So probably like if you already know that the situation might result in like difficult conversation, it makes sense that you would say like, it's a difficult topic, let's start with active listening right away.
Yeah, actually. But it takes a lot of time.
It does.
So it's not always a good idea. And another thing is, it's just not easy. Active listening is not easy.
It's not. Yep. So basically he talks how he's gonna discuss about 7 principles and they're all extremely important and so on.
Yeah.
And then he goes into exploding myths about marriage. So he talks about, so he says that personality problems ruin marriages. That's a myth.
That the connection between that is pretty weak. Like it can sometimes, but usually not.
And that's because if you can accommodate each other's crazy side and handle it with caring, affection, and respect, your marriage can thrive. So it all goes into like, be empathetic, be understanding, even if the other person is like crazy. If you like,
if there are like traumas
or
like certain traits of the person that don't seem reasonable to you, you can still, in most of those cases, you can try to accommodate it.
Yeah. You can like be in peace that the other person, just like you to the other person, have some crazy stuff. He talks about how common interests keep you together is also not always a case, and the reason for it is that you might like interests where both of you are enjoying your time together. Like I don't know, let's say for us it's snowboarding. Like it's a very healthy and like way of spending time
Mm-hmm.
for us. But if our snowboarding trips were like,
Or like board games. Board games cause us often arguments because of our very different play styles.
yeah,
And so, if all we were doing is trying to play board games with each other all the time and getting into fights all the time, that wouldn't be very good for our marriage.
yeah,
Or like
Yeah,
if
board games
if
are hard.
traveling causes you a lot of stress and issues and hurt, then it's better not to travel together.
yeah. It's kind of like finding interests that you both, not you both, but as a couple together, you're kind of bonding on and doing
More of that.
doing more of that. Yeah, if like for snowboarding it works out for us because I think I usually is the one who like picks where we're going in the path.
Mm-hmm.
Because when we snowboard and I have to always follow you, it creates like a very stressful environment for me.
Yeah.
You scratch my back and I'll scratch yours. Also, not exactly works. Doesn't work well. So he basically talks about the couple functions with an unwritten agreement to offer. Yeah.
Basically, he just says that when you try to keep a balance, like how much good you did for me, and then I'll do as much good to you, it's kind of a failing strategy. I mean, one of the things is that we'll have this confirmation bias as well, where people are prone to think that they do more for each other than they actually do, and prone to not notice the things that another person does. So, like if a couple does 50-50 for each other, but their relationship isn't very good, they will probably start like assuming that they do more and another person does less, and just not notice the little things.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's not about I think keeping 50-50, but because you care.
Yeah, you want to help your partner because you care.
I was listening to TikTok recently, and there was an interesting Instagram reel. There was an interesting reel how the woman is like, oh, it's not about like 50-50 the marriage. Because
I think
on
I know
some
exactly which one you're talking
because
about.
on some days like I might be at 20 and it's about pulling that load, and you might be like, oh, I'm in such a great mood, and you might be able to pull that 80% load. So it's like about partnership. But the problem comes is when I'm at 20 and you're like, I'm also at 30%.
Yeah.
And so that's when the arguments happen, when you can't be that partner to each other because you both are not fully like have enough energy for it. So it was kind of interesting. I was like, yeah, it's not 50-50. It's like a partnership of like, when can I put in more because you can't, and so on. He talks about avoiding conflict that will ruin your marriage. I think that's, for me, is self-explanatory.
Yeah.
Like, if you don't talk about it, doesn't mean that the conflict is not there.
Yeah.
Another myth is that affairs are the root cause of divorce. Also makes sense to me. Like, I feel like usually affair is like a collateral like damage from all the issues that you have.
Yeah, it's almost like very clear symptoms of a marriage that's about to fall apart.
Yeah. So like, hopefully, if all of the issue, or not all, or like a good amount of important issues were resolved, that would lead to you not needing an affair, and not necessarily like, oh, I want to have sex with another person. Like, even in that situation, I think in a healthy marriage, you should be able to have that conversation if that's your need.
Yeah.
Then he talks about men are not biologically built for marriage
As a myth.
as a myth. Okay.
No, I guess it's, some people think that men just can't be, that they're like spreaders of the semen,
Yeah.
that they try to have as many offsprings as possible from nature,
Yeah.
right? So,
And then men and women are from different planets.
reminds you of something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
That they can't get along. It's a myth that they can't get along because they're very different, basically.
yeah. I don't think we're that different. Yeah. And that was chapter 1.
That's
Pretty
it.
interesting. It's kind of cool that it's like scientifically based. Want to know what those 7 principles are. Yeah.